Hello, class. Um, Here we are, learning and teaching from home with the most neutral background that I could find. A nice sage green. Hopefully, it forebodes that we're about to think in very sage ways. Um, I'm so punchy, being cooped up with cabin fever, that I will probably make a lot more horrible puns like sage. My apologies in advance. Perhaps it is the perfect time for us to move into nonfiction and into these two books that you have picked, which are Rain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan, right? And A Beautiful Mind by Sylvia Nassar. Here are your two picks. Um, I hope we have, roughly speaking, split these in about half. One is, of course, the memoir slash journalism piece by Susanna Cahalan on her own descent into madness. And the other is about John Nash, the mathematician, written by a journalist who had not interviewed him or met him, I believe, until after she had published her book. So, a little bit different takes on creative nonfiction, but they are both very much about mental health. So it is interesting that we have picked two descent into madness stories, as we have all had to descend into relative isolation, at least not forcing ourselves to be all together physically in a classroom. I hope that everybody is feeling okay and is washing their hands and stop touching your face. Don't chew your nails. Don't rub your eyes. Don't sneeze into your hands. Sneeze in your elbow. And then don't rub your elbow on doorknobs either. And once you touch doorknobs, don't rub your face. OCD and germ theory lecture complete. When I say descent into madness, what other stories have we read that could have had descent into madness? I would argue that even though the first two books we read, 5 Feet Apart and Fault in Our Stars, that even though they dealt with mental health and they dealt realistically with what depression would look like, what anxiety would look like for some of the characters, and spoon theory is definitely involved in mental health and how much energy people have to spend, I would argue that probably the second set of stories that we looked at were more of a descent into madness. It was definitely a descent into madness in the book You, where we watch a serial killer successfully stalk, abuse, and murder um, more than one person, but specifically the main character. And then if we look at things like I Am Legend, I think it could be argued that Neville is descending into madness. And even if he, at the bottom of his madness, at his isolation and his frustration and his drinking and his ranting and raving, that even if he arrives at the correct conclusion at the end that he is the legend, he is the boogeyman, he is the monster, it's at least his descent into monsterhood. So this is a really familiar literary trope that you have picked to study in nonfiction. And we can immediately see from our choices that it's not just in fiction, that clearly Descent into Madness is very much a narrative that plays out in nonfiction, which means that you immediately understand what the shape of some of these stories is going to be. Is that even if each of them show an uptick, if each of them gets optimistic at the end, if we know that Susanna Cahalan recovered well enough to write this story, we know that John Nash is a famous mathematician. Even if there are silver linings to this, we know that the shape of stories is still going to involve some kind of tanking, right? This is the descent. And in this style of literature, the bottom, the person who falls in the hole, the bottom of the hole is called madness. I'm sure you can think of lots of other stories that are a descent into madness. Any film buffs can talk about the many descents into madness of Hitchcock. If you remember watching the Poe animation of The Telltale Heart, that character has a descent into madness. There are tons of them. There are tons and tons, and it's really common. And I love them, and it's really useful for a shape. And it looks at, the plot points that drive the character down into the hole, the themes that go along with those plot points of either redemption or of abandonment and isolation, right? Those messages coming from those plot points, they can be really, really useful. And they illustrate social and personal anxieties and fears, just like we looked at with other monsters. If we are afraid of monsters who lose control, and who can come at us at any time of day, then we imagine a creature who can only come out at night, is limited by sunshine, can be killed by a wooden stake through the heart, but is also glamorous and has some kind of self-control, at least in some settings, right? So descent into madness play off of social anxieties and fears in a similar way, where if humans are afraid of this concept of madness, um, then we find ourselves exploring the fears and anxieties again. Instead of with a monster like a vampire, we get it with a monster that becomes our own mental health. We are going to have to examine carefully a couple of ways that we toss these phrases around. It is not really okay that we're saying madness. It is the name of this literary trope and film trope. It's just a story trope, really. Um, and it's a really fun, useful cliche, and we can examine it really carefully, but there is something inherently problematic about us saying madness, right? Instead of always saying mental health or physical health or physiology or neurobiology or neuroatypical, or, speaking in terms of disability or difference, we decided to go with madness. And I think that reflects more of the fears and anxieties and stereotypes than it does actual health issues that we'll try to look more cautiously at. So, part of the problem with saying madness is that it's equated with insanity, right? And words like madness and insanity and crazy and bonkers, they all avoid that this is actually someone's life. This is someone's experience. This is someone's health that they're struggling with. And it puts it in the realm of way far out there and mystical and magical and, way other. That is so different from my experience of humanity, and it really puts distance between ourselves and the characters that we're reading about, and then it tends to reflect how much space we put between ourselves and other humans who are genuinely struggling, because the terms that we use to examine and support someone's challenges tend to be more about health and care and access. They tend not to be about insanity, madness. Those phrases tend not to be in the most thoughtful versions of how we're looking at human brains, which makes me think I'd also like to talk more about zombies and human brains, but I will try to resist. There are also stereotypes that go along with it. It's not just our approach to it that's affected by the phrase madness, there are stereotypes that go along with it. If I say madness and insanity and crazy and stark raving lunatic, these all conjure images of this wild, out of control, zany, ecstatic experience that someone is probably enjoying, maybe perversely, right? Think of a mad scientist with the evil laugh. The implication is that they're choosing something, that they're enjoying it, that they're laughing with their evil machinations and their craziness. And in reality, that's the stereotype, right? That it is not actually true. And most people with mental health, most people with a developmental disability, most people who are neuroatypical, it's not their choice. They're not enjoying it. Even if there are benefits, even if there are amazing benefits, the title is Beautiful Mind, right? Even if there are benefits and great ways of thinking that are different than average, it's still not as enjoyable roller coaster, um, exoticized villain madness and insanity. It's not the blood curdling, um, screaming and cackling, right? So there are things that make us uncomfortable, and we tend to exaggerate them into the stereotypes instead of looking at, again, the real lived experiences and health concerns and challenges, and how do we support the human beings going through them. So we're going to try to walk that line and enjoy some of the anxiety and the fear of a descent into madness, again, especially as we're isolated with a novel coronavirus. And we're going to try to be really thoughtful with people's lived experience and maybe reorienting some of it to not be so magical and mystical and romanticized, kind of like what we did with not over romanticizing the danger to someone with cystic fibrosis of making out with somebody with a known infection that they could catch right away. Not romanticizing serial killers. We're going to try to walk the same line with Brain on Fire and Beautiful Mind in this and further episodes of Beth Ruins Everything. I'm going to keep checking my notes so I don't forget anything. I guess there's a problem too with the part of the phrase that is descent, because it ignores the ascent, right? It's this irreparable plunge. There's no recovery. Everyone is lost at the bottom of the pit. And as we'll see in both of these nonfiction books, and as most people's experience, is that if there's access to services, um, there's quite a bit of ascent, right? You know, if there's a descent into madness, then resources are kind of this ascent back into whatever kind of recovery and best living condition possible is available. So if we only look at the descent and not the ascent, that is part of the problem. It's not just looking at the madness phrase that goes wrong. It's a really useful shape, right? It's a very strong shape. It is not just a list of facts. In neither of these books will it just be a list of dates and here is what happened on that date. Here's the dose of the medication. Here is the exact phrase that was used by the person when they were speaking, and it, you know, was a symptom in this way. They're going to be stories with a shape, and that is one of the perks of this descent into madness trope, is that it's not a boring list of information. It becomes um, a big story. That both of these are worthy of a film, that you can put real shape and real feeling and real plot points in here that each come with their own themes, right? It's not just a list of information, and your research papers will also not just be a list of information. I'm also pleased that even though we're now going to go more into math and game theory, and we get into a little bit more psychology and journalism headed towards research papers, I think that these fit the theme that you picked really well, talking about how people handle mental health. What do we do with disability narratives? What is the difference between mental health and physical health? Are they ultimately the same thing that we're talking about? Um, are these chronic health conditions, just like cystic fibrosis? What is the connection between physical health and depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and neuroatypical, right? What is this interplay of the genetics leading to these predestined outcomes, right? Cystic fibrosis is genetic. If schizophrenia has a genetic component, if the autoimmune disease that the other author has is genetic, what were the factors that brought it out? What were the factors that led to anybody recovering instead of staying down in the pit of despair? And disability. I think we've been looking a lot at disability and neuroatypical experiences, and that will very much continue. Um, and spoon theory will continue through both A Beautiful Mind and Brain on Fire. So let's get in there and check them out. We're going to look at Brain on Fire first, and then we will jump into A Beautiful Mind. And I think that it's going to be more useful to have one video chat about this rather than two separated out. I think maybe we should just try to cover what we're going to look at for the week, which is, the beginnings of descent into madness and the shape versus the stereotypes that can also be implicated in one video. I don't think it would do very well for us to completely separate either the two books out or the topics out from each other. So I think maybe we're going to have one video per week of me talking to myself about books, which I'm now realizing is basically my life experience. Here I am again, talking to myself about books. Cool. Join me in my own descent into madness. And part of the reason this comes up is because it's not even just called Brain on Fire. Right? It's not just called Brain on Fire. It's called My Month of Madness. That is her subtitle. Her subtitle says madness. It's not just other people calling her crazy as her story develops. She makes it feel like a descent into madness and calls it madness. I think it's also particularly interesting that Cahalan, as she's writing her book, says dedicated to all those without a diagnosis. I think that's pretty important, and I want us to reference that over and over and over again, is that these are the experiences of two people who have fantastic brains that work differently from most and that manage to harvest at least some of the benefits of society despite their difference, and that in a lot of ways they're contrasted in both books with people who never get their diagnosis. They never figure it out, or the diagnosis doesn't fit, or the diagnosis doesn't come with resources, and that for many of the peers of the people in these books, it really is a descent into madness that doesn't necessarily have an ascent. And what is the difference? What allows anyone, a real human or a character, real humans in the case of nonfiction, to have that ascent again? So let's be looking at those as we go through. We are going to be looking at nonfiction in a style called division and analysis. Division and analysis is just a fancier way of saying what we've already been doing. We've been looking at books and stories as a whole and pulling out the pieces to figure out what's going on. We're looking at the individual plot points and then collecting them all together to get a theme, right? There's a message. The plot points are the action and the theme is the message, and division and analysis is like that, right? You chop something to pieces and then you figure out what the whole message is, what the importance of each piece was that led to this umbrella that hangs over every slice of what you just went into with the material. It includes compare and contrast. It includes define and classify. It includes cause and effect. And cause and effect is maybe the fanciest because it answers why. Here's an effect. Why did this happen? And it goes looking back for as many causes that are important. And by the end of both of these books, we'll be doing cause and effect so that you can do cause and effect in your research papers. So here we go with some slicing and dicing and division and analysis. I think we will start with Susanna. Not on the author's note of the first page, but I think on the preface. And again, here's permission to like put stickies on a book or highlight to yourself. This one I did in pen because I knew I was going to keep this copy, but in Beautiful Mind, I did it in pencil. So even if you're not planning on keeping a book, if you're just going to resell it when you're finished with it, if you mark it for yourself in pencil or with sticky notes, they're pretty easily removable. So make yourself notes. It'll help you divide into pieces. And then you can leave yourself notes that are the analysis. Oh, look at this plot point. Here's the message coming out of it. And it's much easier to weave them all together at the end. Okay. Preface, which I guess is page 4-1. Maybe you should see her beautiful face while I. At first, there's just darkness and silence. Are my eyes open? Hello? I can't tell if I'm moving my mouth or if there's even anyone to ask. It's too dark to see. I blink once, twice, 3 times. There's a dull foreboding in the pit of my stomach. That I recognize. My thoughts translate only slowly into language, as if emerging from a pot of molasses. Word by word, my questions come. Where am I? Why does my scalp itch? Where is everyone? Then the whole world around me comes gradually into view, beginning as a pinhole, its diameter steadily expanding. Objects emerge from the murk and sharpen into focus. After a moment, I recognize them. TV, curtain, bed. I know immediately that I need to get out of here. I lurch forward, but something snaps against me. My fingers find a thick mesh vest at my waist, holding me to the bed like a, what's the word? Straitjacket. The vest connects to 2 cold metal side rails. I wrap my hands around the rails and pull up, but again the straps dig into my chest, yielding only a few inches. There's an unopened window next to my right that looks onto a street. Cars, yellow cars, taxis. I'm in New York. Home. Before the relief finishes washing over me, though, I see her, the purple lady. She is staring at me. Help! I shout. Her expression never changes, as if I hadn't said a thing. I shove myself against the straps again. Don't you go doing that, she croons in a familiar Jamaican accent that I will not try to imitate. Sybil? But it couldn't be. Sybil was my childhood babysitter. I haven't seen her since I was a child. Why would she choose today to re-enter my life? Sybil? Where am I? The hospital. You better calm down. It's not Sybil. It hurts. The purple lady moves closer, her breasts brushing against my face as she bends across me to unhook the restraints, starting on the right and moving to the left. With my arms free, I instinctually raise my right hand to scratch my head, but instead of hair and scalp, I find a cotton hat. I rip it off, suddenly angry, and raise both hands to inspect my head further. I feel rows and rows of plastic wires. I pluck one out, which makes my scalp sting, and I lower it to eye level. It's pink. On my wrists is an orange plastic band. I squint, unable to focus on the words, but after a few seconds, the block letters sharpen. Flight risk. So there's Susanna. Um, and I think that section is pretty scary. I think that she maybe puts it up front to address that this is a lot of our worst fears. That this is a really common human anxiety. What if I just wake up crazy? What if I wake up and I'm in a straitjacket, and I can hardly speak? So here we immediately have um, that she is addressing one of these big human concerns, right? Or the human concern of caregivers of what do I do? How do I take care of somebody who is experiencing this? Another big fear and anxiety. And it is terrifying to look at. I can't tell if I'm moving my mouth. The only thing that she recognizes is a horrible feeling in the pit of her stomach. And then she knows that she has to get out of there. And then what do we do reading a narrator who's only certain about a feeling in the pit of her stomach that she needs to leave, even when she figures out that she's in a hospital, right? She has this feeling of the only correct thing that she knows is that she shouldn't be there. When of course the reality for caregivers and the fear for caregivers is that she would actually leave the only place that could potentially assist in her recovery, the only place that she could get a diagnosis or assistance with anything. And the only thing she knows to be true in the world is the exact opposite. And back to this, who is in charge in medical situations? If we wanted Will to be able to say that he didn't want to go through any more trials, if we want Stella to be able to make her own medical choices about, I want to fall in love and be with a person who has the infection that could kill me. If we look back to Hazel and what was his name? The not Will, the guy with cancer, the one who's missing his leg. I don't think I'm going to get there, and I don't have the book within reach, but that we want him to have the choice to go on a fabulous last trip. We want them to be able to have their romance before they die. We want him to have the dignity of palliative care and be mostly at home. We don't want to force him into the hospital. We want Hazel's medical team to let her go have the adventure. And what do we do with the fact that we want those characters to have so much autonomy, but that if Susanna or any of us at any time or our loved ones woke up in a straitjacket that we said was for their own good, we don't want them to have consent to turn it down. Right? Barb didn't want the kids to consent to be too close to each other. Okay? So there's this troubled line of consent again, is how do you insist to someone that you know what's best for them? We didn't want Will's mom to push more trials on him that he didn't want. But from her perspective, and from Barb's perspective, as the nurse for all the kids, they were doing the absolute best they could do to help somebody who they were charged of being the caregiver for. Right? So here again, we find this line of consent for who gets to be in charge and when. Okay. Let's now have a little moment of there's this quote on part 1 that says, I have felt that odd whir of wings in the head, which is by Virginia Woolf. And of course, she's a famous writer. And by all means, go read everything Virginia Woolf. But she's another case that gets pushed into this narrative of a descent into madness, and it's romanticized. That the amazing abilities that she has go along with her madness. That only because she could feel things so deeply was she such a great, amazing, brilliant writer, right? And we can look at this for all kinds of artists, that they're only brilliant because they're insane. The madness is what makes them great. And I want us to keep looking at that, right? And it is possible that we should not stigmatize the challenges faced by anyone with mental health or neurodiversity, neuroatypical processes, different ways of brains working, that maybe they come with assets that are fantastic and amazing. And I also want us to look at if they are perhaps amazing despite, struggling and having challenges, as opposed to romanticizing how wonderful it is that they get to have these challenges that turn them into these geniuses. Let's do actually a little bit of the author's note. Because of the nature of my illness and its effect on my brain, I remember only flashes of actual events and brief but vivid hallucinations from months in which the story takes place. The vast majority of that time remains blank or capriciously hazy. Because I am physically incapable of remembering that time, writing this book has been an exercise in comprehending what was lost. Using the skills I've learned as a journalist, I've made use of the evidence available. Hundreds of interviews with doctors, nurses, friends, and family, thousands of pages of medical records, my father's journal from this period, the hospital notebook that my divorced parents used to communicate with each other, snippets of video footage of me taken by hospital cameras during my stay, and notebook upon notebook of recollections, consultations, and impressions to help me recreate this evasive past. I have changed some names and defining characteristics, but otherwise this is wholly a work of nonfiction, a blend of memoir and reportage. So completely nonfiction, but of something that she largely doesn't remember. Some of her most vivid things are hallucinations. But note that how she's backing this up, how it goes from potentially fiction, a dramatized account of her experience, into full on nonfiction, is that she is citing her sources. She is using primary sources. She is getting as close to the original documentation as is possible. And we're not going to obsess about sources today, but I want us to know going into this that she is obsessively using primary sources really, really well. And how quickly I talk about obsessing like it's an asset. Wah wah. I mean, it is an asset, but there's also an element of wah wah of should I talk so casually about obsessing? And should I talk so casually about something as an asset if we know that it comes with intense downsides? Okay. Let's jump to there's this chapter that is called On the Road Again, which starts on page 31. And I want us to take a look at how it feels to be the person who is struggling with something and how it's perceived by the person who is on the receiving end of the struggle. Okay, so starting on page 31, she is going to a coworker, I believe, Angela. Angela, I have to tell you something strange, I whispered, concerning that people might be listening in, thinking I was crazy. I see bright colors. The colors hurt my eyes. What do you mean? She asked, worry evident in her smile. Every day my behavior had been growing increasingly erratic. But it wasn't until this morning that my ramblings had begun to frighten her. Times Square, the colors, the billboards, they're so bright, brighter than I've ever seen them before. You must really be hungover. She laughed nervously. I didn't drink. I think I'm losing my mind. If you're really concerned, I think you should go back and see a doctor. There's something wrong with me. This is how a crazy person acts. Frustrated with my inability to communicate what was happening to me, I slammed my hands down on the keyboard. The computer glowed back at me, bright and angry. I looked at Angela to see if she saw it too, but she was busy with her email. I can't do this, I shouted. Susanna, hey, what's going on? Angela asked, surprised by the outburst. I had never been histrionic, and now that everyone was staring at me, I felt humiliated and on display, and hot tears streamed down my face and onto my blouse. Why are you crying? I shrugged off the question, too embarrassed to go into the details I didn't understand. Do you want to go out for a walk or something? Grab a coffee? No, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm all fucked up. I'm crying for no reason, I sobbed. As the crying spell took over my whole body, I became prisoner to it. The more I told myself to stop, the more powerful the sensation became. What was causing these hysterics? I fixed on anything my mind could grasp, picking apart the minutiae of my life, anything that felt uncertain. I'm bad at my job. Stephen doesn't love me. I'm broke. I'm crazy. I'm stupid. Many of my colleagues were now returning to the office, dressed in black from the reporter's funeral, which I had not attended because I was too consumed by my own problems. Was this the reason I was crying? I hardly knew that man. Was I crying for myself, or for the possibility that I might be next? Another reporter who sat directly across from Angela turned around. Susanna, are you okay? I hated the attention. I shot her a derisive look, heavy with loathing. Stop it. The tears continued down my face. But I was surprised to realize that I instantly was no longer sad. I was fine. Not happy. Not fine. Happy. No, not happy sublime. Better than I had felt in my entire life. The tears kept coming, but now I was laughing. A pulse of warmth shot up my spine. I wanted to dance or sing or something, anything except sit here and wallow in imaginary misery. I ran to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. As the cold water flowed, the bathroom stalls suddenly looked alien to me. How was it that civilization had gotten so far, but we still defecated in such close proximity to one another? I looked at the stalls, and hearing the flush of toilets, I could not believe I had ever used one before. When I went back to my desk, my emotions now relatively stable. Right. So that's relatively stable for her at this point. Um, so many things are happening here. So many things are happening. So let's look for a moment at how she's feeling about this. So let's employ some of that empathy that's so important for humans. Um, if we're whispering about something, Angela, I have to tell you something strange. What does it imply about how she's feeling? How is she feeling if she's whispering this? And then she says, concerned that people might be listening in, thinking I was crazy. Right? Of course we can go biology and medical and psychology and say, well, that's standard paranoia. But that's really distancing ourselves from how desperate she feels, how upset she feels, and how alone in this she feels. She desperately, badly wants to reach out to somebody, but also understands that they're going to look at her like she's crazy, that it's not just paranoia. She keeps referencing that she understands that what's happening isn't quite on point. It's not standard for her, and that it's not some kind of human average that she's used to. Um, every day, my behavior had been growing increasingly erratic. That's not just her own recollection. She went back and talked to Angela. But it wasn't until this morning that I had begun to frighten her. So how does it feel to be someone in trouble and the person that you're looking to for help is scared of you? How would it feel to be in need of assistance and the person closest to helping you is looking at you like you are the problem, that you are scared? Okay. Um, I think I'm losing my mind, right? That is a very articulate way of spelling out what she thinks is happening, right? That is as close as she can get to saying out loud what is happening. And she's frustrated with her inability to communicate what's happening. And we know that this is not just with autoimmune disorders. This can be with any kind of neurodiversity, developmental disabilities, or seizure disorders, or traumatic brain injury, a whole slew of mental health diagnoses. This inability to communicate, and how frustrating that would be to feel something is not on par, something is going a little bit sideways, I need some assistance with this, and people are scared of you, and you can't tell them, you can't describe with language what is happening. Maybe even picture autism, right? And how someone nonverbal is still processing information and can't say it, which is another human anxiety and fear that she's addressing for us. Um, I'm bad at my job. Stephen doesn't love me. I'm broke. I'm crazy. I'm stupid, right? And she says, I became a prisoner to it, the crying spell, even though she tries to stop, right? So how powerless she feels. She feels powerless, and what do we do when we feel powerless? And does that explain if somebody hits a keyboard, like I I need help? In some ways, what is an actual cry for help? I need assistance. I can't articulate what is happening, and I need assistance. And the only form of outreach that's available is to um, do something slightly more drastic than when having an average human conversation. And that she feels prisoner to it, and that she can't stop it, even if she can, on some level, see that something is not going right for her. She can't stop it, right? Just recognizing it doesn't mean she's in charge of it. She can't. And how many other people does this apply to? How many other people can't control how something in their life is manifesting? And what do we do then as humans who are watching this unfold, right? What does Angela do? Angela is worried, she's concerned, she's listening, she's engaging in the conversation. And then she has this nervous laugh. I think you must be really hungover. So humans, when we're nervous, tend to make light of it. We tend to make some little joke that makes ourselves feel better, maybe helps somebody else feel better. Let's lighten the situation. Does it work? It doesn't. It doesn't work. It probably didn't even work for Angela in the moment. But it's this human tick. It's our go-to. Um, and what if what if Susanna had been hungover? What if she was having a substance abuse issue and her friend giggled about it? How how would that go if it wasn't just a joke? And how belittling is it to someone who's having a genuine struggle to joke that it's just an average hangover, right? So it wouldn't be great to be minimizing an actual alcohol issue, and it wouldn't be great to be minimizing her struggle as an every other weekend hangover in Wisconsin culture, right? Both very minimizing. Um, Even the language that Susanna uses about it is kind of revealing of what we think of other people who are struggling. She calls it an outburst. She says that she must be, this is how a crazy person acts. And again, a lot of these are stereotypes that don't focus on the challenge, on the struggle, right? When we say a crazy person, the implication is not there is somebody who is struggling and is a prisoner to what is happening in their life. We tend to say there's somebody who is losing it. Histrionic, hysterical, right? These are terms that are applied to somebody who isn't even trying to contain themselves. Who slams on a keyboard? Somebody who's not even trying to be average. And we can see from her own narrative that that's not what it's actually like. That she understands. She feels embarrassed. She feels horrified. She feels afraid. And um, she's not, banging on the keyboard for no reason. It's not her just having an outburst. She's not just acting out. Um, and I keep thinking of a friend of mine who is a licensed family therapist. And she asked for help putting paint up on her wall. And she had stenciled out this message, particularly for working with young kids who had experienced trauma and their families, that said, behaviors are messages, right? And I keep thinking about that as Susanna goes through her story. Is that instead of seeing the stereotypes, instead of seeing, oh, someone's overreacting, someone is so crazy, someone's having an outburst, to look at it and notice that, especially if somebody is having a hard time verbally communicating, that a lot of these are messages. And that, as she proceeds further into care, people are trying to make sense of these as messages. That symptoms tend to be a great example of, this is not somebody being mean. This is not somebody being stupid. This is not someone being lazy. This is someone giving me a message that something is wrong, that they need support for something. And so I think it's really interesting to compare the language and how she's feeling about it to the expectations that we have going along with that language. This is how a crazy person acts, right? That maybe we hold that even against ourselves, that when there is a message, a distress message, that what happens if we smooth out that distress message as um, and with an eye roll about, ugh, such an overreaction. Ugh, what drama, right? And she hits the keyboard and she's crying in the bathroom and she's having a laughing jag, and she's not being dramatic. They're messages, they're symptoms, and how would any of us do any differently in this scenario? Um, and what the stereotypes are of anyone who has actions or reactions or communication that is not typical. I guess I can't possibly resist obsessing about primary sources. Um, my doodles in the book are not the primary sources, but look when she writes insomnia. This is her showing you a primary source. She doesn't just cite that she has a note that she wrote to herself. She doesn't just say, hey, I drew this. I mean, to be clear, I did that part because I felt sad when I saw it, because I recognized it as a warning sign, because I read the back of the book and have the spoilers. Um, she's not just saying, I wrote this note this one time. She's not just citing how you could go Google and find this note. She is showing you the primary source. That is amazing. And it is very clear that she is an extremely skilled journalist who knows to reveal her sources like this. Which says, people are desperate, they'll do anything. Which gives me the face that I drew in the margins, because I can recognize that as a message and empathize with the feeling. Not just that it's paranoia, that she's worried about how other people are feeling, but how it feels to be desperate, and she is trying to do anything to communicate what's happening for her. Um, so she is also having seizures, and trying to parse these. And she is in the hospital having an MRI because she's had a seizure, and her boyfriend, her partner, I don't think fiance, sorry, I missed that detail in here, has taken her in and is waiting with her for the results of the MRI after having a seizure. I convinced myself the tech who had flirted with me when I got my MRI was clearly behind all of this. I will not stay in this room. Get me out of this room now, I commanded. I will not die here. I will not die with these freaks. A doctor approached my bedside. Yes, we will move you right away. I was triumphant, delighted by my newfound power. People listen when I speak. Instead of worrying that my life was out of control, I began to focus on anything that made me feel strong. A nurse and a male assistant wheeled my bed out of the room and into a private one nearby. As the bed moved, I clutched Stephen's hand. I felt so sorry for him. He didn't know that I was dying. I don't want you to get upset, I said softly, but I'm dying of melanoma. Stephen looked spent. Stop it, Susanna. Don't say that. You don't know what's wrong. I noticed tears welling up in his eyes. He can't handle it. Suddenly, the outrage returned. I do know what's wrong, I yelled. I'm going to sue him. I'm going to take him for all he's worth. He thinks he can hit on me and just let me die. He can't just do that. No, I'm going to destroy him in court. Stephen withdrew his hand softly as if he'd been burned. Susanna, please stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. The MRI guy, he hit on me. He didn't catch the melanoma. I'm suing. The young resident interrupted me mid-rant. This is something you might want to look into when you get home. If you need a good dermatologist, I'd be happy to recommend one. Unfortunately, there's nothing more we can do here. The hospital had already conducted a CT scan, a basic neurological exam, and a blood test. We have to discharge you and advise that you see a neurologist first thing tomorrow. Discharged? Stephen interjected. You're letting her go? But you don't know what's wrong, and it could happen again. How can you just let her go? I'm sorry, but seizures are fairly common. Sometimes they just happen once and never happen again. But this is an emergency room and we can't keep her here just to see. I'm sorry. My advice is to see a neurologist first thing tomorrow morning. I'm still suing that guy. The doctor nodded patiently, and departed to address the gunshot wounds and drug overdoses that awaited him. So there's so much here being revealed. Her caregiver is exhausted and scared and frustrated. And she's having a really hard time parsing what's happening. And she is trying. She's trying so hard to figure out what's going on. And of course, somebody who feels this out of control is going to try to grapple for control of something, anything, right? That's what humans try to do. We try to organize things. We try to find patterns. We will cling desperately to whatever information we can parse, right? So you can notice how they're feeling, and then what's happening systematically. Systematically, the techs and the ER doctor have done what they can do. And I mean, she's probably not joking when she says often gunshot wounds and overdoses. This is a big city ER. Emergency rooms can't admit people for monitoring. And what does that do to somebody who's having a crisis? If somebody is having a crisis, has had seizures, is displaying symptoms that are not standard for them, and they have to be discharged because the system can't handle it, I think that there's a huge piece of social critique that's going through here, right? I think that Susanna Cahalan, again, with her dedication to all those who never get a diagnosis, she is highlighting how many people can't be served, including when they are trying their best to be articulate, when they have a caregiver there with them to be articulate, when they have insurance, when they've had a seizure, they make it to the ER, and then they still can't be treated. And the doctor can't really do anything about it. He can't prioritize somebody's first seizure over the people who are medically closer to death in the emergency room, and how triage works. Right? I think there's a big piece of societal critique in here, and how do we change that? What do we fix? What is Susanna going to encourage us to do? Where is she leading us? What is the message of all these plot points going to end up being? I think it's likely that one of the themes in here is not just going to be have empathy for people who are struggling, and take them seriously. I think it's also going to lead us towards plenty of the society critique that she is leading us to consider. How can we better serve not just her, who has a whole bunch of advocates for her, but how would it be? What would it look like to serve everybody, including those in her dedication who never get a diagnosis, or not a diagnosis that fits, or a diagnosis that comes with no resources? So I'm going to pause here for Brain on Fire, but I think I would like you to continue with the same things at least through not page 53, which is called Mixed Episodes. I think maybe Breaking News. I think get through at least 86 pages of Brain on Fire through Breaking News. Okay? All right. And now we are going to look at some of the same issues in A Beautiful Mind. And how does a descent into madness work really similarly in here? And how does a descent into madness work differently in here? And how much of it should we be critiquing? And what division and analysis can we do? How many pieces can we pull this into and then extract meaning? How can we extract meaning from the pieces that we look at? Okay, so Beautiful Mind is about John Nash, who was maybe still is, a famous mathematician for working in game theory, which is trying to add rationality and not quite algorithms, but that there is a rational balance even when people have individual choice, which ends up being applied not just to board games and strategy games, but to the economy. Often an economy is referred to as game theory, and John Nash is somebody who had quite a bit to say about rationality. And one of the themes that really comes out in here, that maybe we could also go looking for in Brain on Fire, is what emphasis do we place on rationality in the midst of things that are not rational? What is that human dichotomy about? Oof, this book is dense and amazing. I'm really enjoying it. Unlike Brain on Fire, I've never read this one before. It's really dense, but I'm also finding it really fantastic. So I hope that some of us will not only read Brain on Fire, but jump in here with John Nash as well. pretty cool stuff. And it works really well for nonfiction because, again, this is a journalist and a writer trying to find sources to use, which is what you're going to do for your research paper on a topic of your choosing. So it won't be that bad. Okay. In June 2006, I went to St. Petersburg to track down the 40-year-old mathematician who had solved the Poincare conjecture. Repeatedly, it was French. It threw me off. I apologize for my French. Reputedly a hermit with wild hair and long nails who lived in the woods on mushrooms, he was up for a Fields Medal and a $1 million cash prize, but had gone into hiding. Not just from the media, but from the math community. Meanwhile, some folks in Beijing were claiming that they'd beaten him to the punch. It was a great story, if only somebody could find him. What are the stereotypes that you see there of crazy people, of the insane, of madness? What about that is sensationalized? What about this is not just the author immediately saying somebody was struggling and needed support? I would pull out reputedly a hermit. How exotic, how fascinating. With wild hair and long nails who lived in the woods on mushrooms. Right? He had gone into hiding. I mean, think about even what some of the clinical terms are for things like self-isolation. It's very different from describing it as gone into hiding to live in the woods on mushrooms. Right? Notice right away how the stereotypes of anybody who's struggling with any kind of neurodiversity, mental health diagnosis, disability is portrayed as this extreme, this outlandish, captivating creature that we should use this crazy voice for. And then I use the word crazy like it was nothing. Wah wah. After 4 frustrating days in Russia, my colleague and I hadn't found a soul who had seen or talked to the guy or his family in years. Then, when we had pretty much thrown in the towel, we stumbled on his mother's apartment more or less by accident, and voila! There was the hermit, dressed in a sports jacket and Italian loafers, evidently having lunch and watching soccer on TV. Doesn't really sound wild and crazy and extreme. He's having lunch and watching TV and wearing a suit. There are lots of stories about the rise and fall of remarkable individuals, but there are very few stories, much less true stories, with a genuine third act. That's not true. We talked about how the beginning, middle, and end is universal to almost every story. Nash's story has a third act. Act 3 of Nash's life story is his miraculous reawakening. You'd have to be a real hermit not to know the inspiring story of John Nash. So he's inspiring, he's miraculous. Again, she started with the wild sensationalized things, then was like, the reality is somebody in a suit watching TV and having lunch. And then goes back to miraculous reawakening. It is the third act that makes Nash's story resonate with people all over the world, most especially those who suffer from devastating mental illnesses or love someone who does. Devastating, right? Not like, it's almost a third to a half of the population that has a mental health diagnosis. This is pretty average human stuff. A lot of humans struggle with this. It's putting at the extremes again. This devastating mental illness. And not that we shouldn't experience the emotions of devastation that come along with every human challenge, but it's kind of doing this othering, distancing thing where this is an extreme. This is not an average human challenge to be empathized with. This is way out there. Insanity, madness. Clearly, I've been watching too much news about COVID-19. At one point in the movie, when it looks as if things were all over for Nash, his wife Alicia takes John's hand, places it over her heart, and says, I have to believe that something extraordinary is possible, and something extraordinary was possible. And then also look who carries the burden of the extraordinary thing. Not only is this being sensationalized and made extreme and crazy and zany and way out there, but that the intimate partner is responsible for handling it. Right? Remember back to You, where the bad guy um, is expecting that the woman that he is stalking and abusing is responsible for all of his actions. And then, you know, how we've talked about Beauty and the Beast not being a great example, because it's not that the villagers should go after the beast. You know, they should give Beast a chance, but it shouldn't be all put on Belle. That Belle shouldn't by herself be responsible for transforming a monster, right? And here we again have that the pivotal person in this is one woman. It's not the world saying, "Hey, this is an average human struggle that we should all get comfortable with and deal with." They're saying that Belle, Alicia, that I can't remember the woman's name that the bad guy kills in You, that they're all expected to deal with it. Who do we put in charge of somebody that we think is this extreme? One single person by herself. Okay. Um, of all the letters I've received from readers, my favorite came from a homeless man. It arrived in a dirty envelope with no return address. I don't get very many clean envelopes in the mail, so just notice how some of the descriptions go along with which character is being talked about in books like these. Basically, every piece of mail that touches those conveyor belts is disgusting. It's like handling cash money and coins. Gross. None of them are clean, but because of who she's talking about, she makes sure that we know that this is a dirty envelope with no return address. How often do any of us remember to put a return address on? And it was scrawled on neon orange paper. It was signed Berkeley Baby. It would never have made it past the New York Times mailroom after that anthrax scare. The letter writer turned out to have been the night rewrite editor on the Metro desk at the New York Times before he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in the mid 1970s. Since then, he had adopted the name Berkeley Baby and lived on the streets of Berkeley, California, near the university, a forlorn, sad figure, not unlike the Phantom of Fine Hall. He wrote, "John Nash's story gives me hope that one day the world will come back to me too." That is a lot to parse through. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, as the world, return to these struggling humans who are facing really fairly average challenges, but how are they spoken of, right? If John Nash is, you know, isolating himself and this man is all alone, we should look at every dirty envelope, which is say all envelopes, and look inside and you know, see what message is available and what fantastic necessary content is in there. We should get hope from stories of mental illness, of autoimmune disorders, of cystic fibrosis, etc. But should we make them extreme? And has this man isolated himself? Is he forlorn and sad? Obviously, those are super valid emotions that we should explore, but is he being described um, in a way that makes him a little bit of a villain or pathetic? You know, like is he pathetic in ways that we won't see John Nash because he's a mathematical genius? Um, are others seen as pathetic in ways that we won't see Susanna Cahalan because she is a skilled journalist who can tell her own story? And what is the difference between um, wanting to encourage someone not to isolate themselves, but then abandoning those that we see as forlorn and sad and the dirty envelopes of the world. So abandonment versus isolation, and what adjectives do we use? Um, I was interviewing a Princeton mathematician professor about some trade statistics when he mentioned a rumor that a crazy mathematician who hung around the math building might be on the short list for a Nobel Prize in economics. Also, what does it imply when you say hung around? We're not saying um, a brilliant mathematician has long office hours in the math building. A crazy mathematician who hung around the math building at night. We're not speaking about the hero of this book in ways that would indicate, what just a typical human experience with the full range of emotions are. I think it's leaning a little bit in one direction with all these descriptions. Um, Lloyd Shapley, another pioneer of game theory, described Nash as a graduate student in the late 1940s. When he wrote his seminal papers on game theory, he was immature, obnoxious, he was a brat. What redeemed him was a keen, logical, beautiful mind. So now you know to whom I owe the title of this biography. Fantastic, keen, logical, beautiful mind. So many different kinds of minds are beautiful. What kind of backhanded compliment is this, though? He was immature, he was obnoxious, he was a brat. Are those the same terms that we might have for Susanna when she is slamming her keyboard around, when somebody homeless is, speaking to the squirrels in the tree, um, or when somebody with Asperger's in high school couldn't make a socially spot on joke? Um, Immature, obnoxious, and a brat. And then also, what do we place on a value higher than that? If instead of a math genius, he'd been a painter, would human beings have been so willing to overlook immature, obnoxious brattiness? Is it okay that that's how we perceive people who are struggling? And if somebody is being socially inappropriate, when do we allow it and when do we shun it? If he had been a grocery store clerk who acted in these ways, would he have had the same level of support? And is it okay to look at somebody who's struggling and see this? And should it be on any one person to do that outreach, or should we have systems in place that somehow reach out and guarantee that neither the grocery store clerk or the obnoxious, immature brat math genius are going to be either isolated and left alone to their struggles, or only the problem of the people who already know them and love them? Is it okay to talk about people like they're a problem? No, probably not. Um, John Nash buys himself a $2 Starbucks coffee after recovering from an episode of schizophrenia. And she asks him what he's enjoyed about his success. And he says that he enjoyed buying the $2 Starbucks coffee and says, poor people can't do that. There are going to be a lot of places in both of these books where we notice that because she's a journalist with a family, because she has these skills and has other advocates and a little bit of money to get basic needs met, she has access to recovery that others do not. And that John Nash, because he's a mathematical genius and not a grocery store clerk, has access to successes um, that others will not. Um, she also says, that's the power of stories, which is obnoxious because let's all be honest. We all know that writers love to write. That it's like John Green's intro to Fault in Our Stars. Like, my story is powerful. Don't go looking for facts. You can't really have it both ways. You, in fact, are just an average writer enjoying an average story that people will get something out of. I don't love it when authors do that. There are other things in here, like he's described as quirky, makes math seem cool, the pacing is fast. And there's some compare and contrast in here as division and analysis. Here is a comparison and contrast of insane versus sane that again kind of pushes on those extremes and the stereotypes rather than um, more of us as a people recognizing human challenges when they happen. And this is in the prologue. John Forbes Nash Jr., mathematical genius, inventor of a theory of rational behavior, visionary of a thinking machine, had been sitting with his visitor, a mathematician, for nearly half an hour. It was late on a weekday afternoon in the spring of 1959, and though it was only May, uncomfortably warm, Nash was slumped in an armchair in one corner of the hospital lounge, carelessly dressed in a nylon shirt that hung limply over his unbelted trousers. His powerful frame was slack as a rag doll's, his finely molded features expressionless. He had been staring dully at a spot immediately in front of the left foot of Harvard professor George Mackey, hardly moving except to brush his long dark hair away from his forehead in a fitful, repetitive motion. His visitor sat upright, oppressed by the silence, acutely conscious that the doors to the room were locked. Mackey finally could contain himself no longer. His voice was slightly querulous, but he strained to be gentle. "How could you?" began Mackey. "How could you, a mathematician, a man devoted to reason and logical proof? How could you believe that extraterrestrials are sending you messages? How could you believe that you are being recruited by aliens from outer space to save the world? How could you?" Nash looked up at last and fixed Mackey with an unblinking stare as cool and dispassionate as that of any bird or snake. "Because," Nash said slowly in his soft, reasonable southern drawl, as if talking to himself, "the ideas I had about supernatural beings came to me the same way that my mathematical ideas did, so I took them seriously." It is remarkable that slumped in an armchair. I do not have great posture right now. What are the chances that because we're not trying to portray me as insane, we would be like, she was slumped. Her fleece, she was carelessly dressed in her Patagucci fleece. She wore unbelted trousers. Limp. I mean, how many of us are wearing belts right now? Are we noticing things about John Nash in this situation that are true of most of us right now, but they're only being noticed about John Nash because he's being depicted as this genius with a beautiful mind who is batshit crazy, right? So there are some stereotypes coming into play here. When we picture someone crazy on the street, a lot of these come into play, right? Staring off into nowhere, expressionless. I mean, expressionless is kind of literally not possible. And again, we're talking about a mathematician slouching in a chair. It's not that big of a deal. Um, and his hair brushed in a fitful and repetitive motion. How many times have I done this? Or probably something like this, absent-mindedly, without knowing I was doing it. Am I being fitful and having repetitive motions? Are we all having repetitive motions throughout the day? And is it not a big deal because we're not considered brilliant geniuses with a beautiful mind who are also absolutely insane? Um, and the questions from his friend, I love that it's earnest and that he's going to visit his friend and that he's asking questions. We should all interrogate things and ask questions and connect. It's great that he's going to see his buddy. But do we pretty clearly have answers to this? How could you believe that extraterrestrials are sending you messages? He's diagnosed with schizophrenia. And even if somebody didn't have the diagnosis, we could recognize this, right? We recognize this human experience of not being able to parse all of the input or all of the output or all of the thoughts that are in someone's head. We know this exists. We've known this for millennia. We've described this since, history was a thing. As soon as humans started recording things, we had this idea that there were people who couldn't reliably tell what was perfectly real and what wasn't, and that they still had some great ideas, right? Aristotle supposedly said to his protege that no great genius can exist without a touch of madness. This, this is not a new concept. So he's reaching out and he's connecting and he's asking questions the way we would hope, but he's doing it to someone that more than just the author have started describing in a very unsettling way, while some obvious answers are present. Um, and also, I think it reveals some nice, thoughtful moments here with someone who is struggling. Someone who is struggling has found a way to articulate that his brilliant math ideas seem just the same to him as his rantings and ravings about aliens. And why did I call it ranting and ravings about aliens, but I didn't call it ranting and raving about math? And perhaps we will. So, therein is part of the challenge comparing sanity to insanity, and what does an insane person's outfit and face and posture look like, and how does a sane person ask questions that have really obvious answers, right? They're pretty obvious answers to this friend's questions, but he's asking them, and it's not a sign of his insanity because he is labeled as sane. He is labeled as sane, so his question with obvious answers is just fine. So I would like us to keep looking at both of these stories of a descent into madness. And how do we feel about saying madness? How much do we want to romanticize the brilliance? How much do we want to emphasize that not everybody gets to recover? Not everybody even gets a diagnosis. Not everybody gets support. And what kind of themes can we pull out of both of these that are really familiar? And with both of them, of course, audiobooks are fantastic, movies are fantastic, um, but grab a paperback or a digital copy. It doesn't really matter, but grab a copy that has the text that you can look at so you can go through and find some of the evidence for some of the themes that you see coming out. I hope that some of these questions and talking points have been useful. I will try to find a cooler background next time. Maybe I will have a cozy bonfire chat about books with myself for your benefit next time. And even just as I glance over at the books, I can't stop talking about them. I'm noticing that I left myself notes on the inside of just the quotes, just the blurbs from other people about this book. A brilliant book. So this concept of genius, right? That we don't mind a touch of madness as long as someone is also brilliant, right? If someone is smart as a journalist, as a mathematician, we won't hold their human challenges against them quite as much, maybe. Um, Reads like a fine novel. Notice both of these are not a list of dates and places and names and facts. They are not lists of boring information. They have a shape. They're telling a story. And your research papers will have to do that too. powerfully affecting a three handkerchief read, that there's going to be some tragedy in both of these. And have we ever had a story where somebody did not fall into a hole and have some tragedy and big feelings? A triumph of intellectual biography. That's the most boring way I've ever heard any story described. Um, a remarkable look into the arcane world of mathematics and the tragedy of madness. So the stereotype of mathematicians is that they are arcane and obscure, and that madness is just a tragedy for us to watch unfold like it's a theater play. So, stereotypes and struggles and concepts of average and concepts of what is health and who is worthy of redemption, and is this just a descent, and how do we feel about madness? Yay! Spring break is over. Now we learn things online. Okay. Have a good one. See you next week.